So thank you and welcome to this new episode of the AfriTech Connect, where discussions unfold to explore the forefront of spatial technology, inclusive leadership, project management, and wellness within the AfriTech community, but also beyond. I want to remind you that, as I said within this grounding session, that this space is yours. The AfriTech Connect space is for all of us. So feel free to take as much space as you need today. Today's core theme will be inclusive leadership, and more precisely under the title of this episode, which is Inclusive Women Leadership, Exploring Social Identity. This session will be in in three parts. So the first part will be a presentation. We will then follow up with a discussion. And finally, there will be a Q&A section where you, members of the audience, will be able to share your thoughts, your questions, either through the chat or even by unmuting yourself. For this purpose, if at any point during this session you have questions or comments, please put it in the chat so that you don't forget about it, and then we can come back to it at the end during the third section. So without further ado, I think it's important for us to think of this title that we've brought for today, but also I would like to introduce myself. So I'm Anne-Gaëlle Carré, but you can call me Anga. And we have also with us tonight as co-host Selena Ropnaren, which I'm very happy to have with me. Thank you to be here with us tonight, Selena.
You're welcome.
And so our session, as I said at the beginning, the title is Inclusive Women Leadership, which is exploring social identity. And what we will be discussing today is social identity. So what is social identity? This is a very big question that I'm sure all of us had at one point think about.
That's actually very true, Angel. First of all, very good evening to each and every one of you. And since we have an upcoming International Women's Day, I want to say very happy upcoming International Women's Day to all of us. And I know that this year the theme is about accelerating actions, and we wanted to do this episode on social identity as a way to accelerate actions with strategic insights on how women can actually bank on social identity to improve their leadership, because we know that the best way to advance progress, in terms of gender equality, gender justice, is to actually keep learning and unlearning and keep training ourselves so that we can refine our perspectives on so many topics. And to answer your question, Anne-Gaëlle, social identity, in short, actually refers to how we label ourselves depending on the groups to which we belong. So it's a perception of oneness with a group of persons, and it defines people in relation to the social groups that we belong to and how they differ from other social groups and individuals. And at the end of the day, the aspects of social identity are so crucial in our lives because they affect how we lead and how we work with others. But it's not to be mistaken with personal identity, which is a different thing that we are going to see during the second part of this episode. And social identity is based on a theory in the sense that it refers to the identity of an individual, and that individual forms that identity of himself or herself based on the group memberships that he or she belongs to.
That's really interesting, Selena. And I think maybe it would be interesting to talk about where that theory come from. Maybe what is the story behind social identity?
It's actually going back to the history based on the 1970s. It's actually based on social psychology in the sense that it was developed. The social identity theory was first developed, I think, around 1978, 1979 by two psychologists. One was Henry Tajfel, one was John Turner. So one was a Polish-British social psychologist, and Henry, like kind of like way back, he laid the foundation for the theory, and he was doing a research on intergroup behavior. He was doing an experiment, and the minimal group experiment at that time showed how people quickly form group identities and they favor their own groups even based on trivial distinctions. Whereas like John Turner at that time, also later he expanded on this work, and he contributed to create like the self-categorization theory, and he decided that he needed to further expand and explain how, for examples, individuals define themselves in relation to social groups. But it's interesting because like afterwards, like even like as from year 2000, 2010 onwards, like we had like so many other people that helped to refine the theory. For example, there was Michael Hogg. He contributed like significantly by applying the social identity theories to areas like leadership, uncertainty reduction, group cohesion, team cohesion. And his work explored more how uncertainty about one's identity can lead to stronger group identification. And nowadays, like for women to lead, it's imperative that we understand the different social identities that actually form part of us besides our personal identity.
That's very
If that,
interesting, Selena. Yeah, definitely.
yeah.
That's an exciting history, and as we can see on this new slide, an individual's social identity is a combination of the various different in-groups to which they belong. And I like the way you actually depict that in different points, and I'm sure throughout this presentation we'll learn even more.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And so social psychology is quite of a very interesting topic because it forms part of our daily lives. And social identity is part of who we are within the groups that we belong to. And each and every one, we belong to different groups, different memberships. And for example, as you just read that an individual social identity is a combination of the various different in groups to which they belong. For example, family. I belong to a college group. I may have graduated in a business class. I have attended the AfriTech Fellowship. I may form part of a football team, a fitness team. So these are the different combinations. But further to
Mhm.
that, we have different ranges of social identities. So, for example, an individual is likely to have a range of different social identities that are based on each specific group to which they belong. So,
Mhm.
if you belong to a combination of family, in that same family, within that same family group structure, you will have different social identities. You can have a social identity of a mother, of a daughter, of a sister, of a cousin, of a niece, but you can also have a different social identity. For example, in a fitness group that you belong to, in a fellowship, you can have different social identities based on the career that you do. So at the end of the day, it's important to understand that every person who belongs to different groups, and it's actually important to understand that when we are born, like some of the groups are actually like assigned to us, but over the years, like we develop a liking to different types of groups that we want to belong to, whether like school, whether somebody has been imposed on us, or whether a fellowship, a training, a degree, a diploma, a fellowship, I don't know, an activity, a part-time, anything like that. And all from combining the combination and the ranges, this leads us actually to what we call social categorization, which means that when Turner, like in 1979, he actually like developed this theory. he saw that there were three different categories out of it. So the first one was social categorization, which is like the mental process of classifying people, including ourselves, oneself, into groups that are based on shared characteristics such as race, gender, ethnicity, can be occupation, age, or interest. And while it helps to simplify the social world, it can also lead to stereotypes, any form of bias, any form of in-group or out-group distinctions that influence attitudes and behaviors towards different social groups. So this mental process actually concerns each and every one, because every one of us, we are actually in this process at different stages of our life of classifying ourselves into groups because we belong to different groups. It can be a technical group, it can be a gender group, it can be training group again, it can be any form of group. But these groups at times, whenever like we have to categorize them in our very mental process, while it helps us like, for example, to differentiate into which groups, which gender, race, ethnicity, activity, status, occupational status, or whatsoever, it helps simplify like the society, but at the same time, it can lead to a lot of stereotypes. And for example, what happens is if you say, hey, but you know, I'm a millennial, or someone can say, but I'm from generation X. Someone can say, no, but I'm an Italian. Someone can say, oh, but when we look at that person, no, he's just an African, he's just an Indian, he's just an American. So all of these different groups actually start uh, to combine in our heads because we're taught that. And in a way, it helps us again, like to differentiate and appreciate the different differences. But at the same time, it puts us into a certain forms of prejudice that sometimes we start to create also mentally towards others without realizing, because we were brought up in that way. So social categorization, it's that starting point, where stereotypes form in the minds of people towards groups.
Yeah, that's really interesting, all of what you're saying, Selena. And it's mind-blowing how much we don't think about social identity and, as you say, social categorization, because we often only associate someone based on what we see or one aspect of her. For example, like I can be, like you said, within my family group, I can be a daughter, a sister, but I can also, like one day I can be a mother. I'm also a niece. I'm also going to be an auntie. And I think throughout a life, someone has so many aspects of their social identity that is stolen from them because people do not necessarily see this multidimensional aspect of it. And I liked how you talked about the different categorization, and it is very interesting how it actually brings us to the stereotypes because just like this picture on the screen, we often associate little girls to, cute little bunnies or anything linked to the kitchen or pampering herself, and everything sports or motor cars or cars, toys are associated to little boys. And we realize then that this aspect is present within us as soon as we are born into our life. Because even like when we think about gender reveals, for instance, why does it have to be pink for girls and then blue for boys? It's at the very beginning of our life. We already set this tone of you need to be in this group and you need to be in this category. And as you say, it does bring us to a lot of stereotypes. I don't know if maybe you would want to share some example of stereotypes that you've came along throughout your journey.
Well, I think like a lot, for example, when we travel, like we hear about a lot of stereotypes, but even from here itself, for example, I mentioned sometimes we hear people say, okay, but all Americans are loud, or people would say, but Italians eat only pasta. Some say that, but all Africans are all blacks. or Indians are all poor, or for example, this generation of young people is just lazy. These are all stereotypes that we hear, from different corners of the world. Whereas like when we look at the African diversity is huge. When we look at Indians, we have some very, very wealthy, highly intelligent Indian people in the world. And not all Americans are loud and braggy. Not all young people are lazy. So it's important to understand that depending on what we hear in the groups, and the memberships that we belong to, like these help actually to form or define our perception of reality. So it can be positive, but it can also be like very, very negative, because like it brings us like in a state of mode where we compare. So comparison can be healthy for some, but comparison actually, once we categorize in social identity and we start to compare ourselves, it can lead to either like something that is positive, or it can lead to something negative as well. I don't know if you get the point on that, Anne-Gaëlle.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting, like you say, bringing it back to how those aspects, once they've put us within a box, like we say, like, this term is often associated to social identity, how people put us within a box. And I think once we are put into a box, we need now to face this social comparison, which is like this slide is saying, these comparison is when an individual group compares themselves either favorably or unfavorably to another group. And this is something that maybe we've been able to witness within the society, but we do not necessarily address it because we think it's the norm. We think it's how life is supposed to be and how the society is supposed to function. But all of those bits and pieces are like puzzles fitting into each other, or like we say, the domino effect. So as soon as we are put into a box, the comparison happen, or so then we see ourselves at not good enough, or some people just think of them as they are the best in the world or better than other people, And I think what for me, it would be interesting to see how deeply that comparison can go.
Definitely, definitely. And what happens is that the comparison itself, once we categorize, then we start to compare. So we can either like compare in a way where it boosts our self-esteem, or we could say, for example, hey, I belong to a group of for example, amazing women who are always motivated, who are making things happen in their lives. So I feel part of a wonderful group of women, or so my self-esteem is boosted. Or I can also say, oh, but I form part of a group of women who are always gossiping. So I always feel down, always feel discouraged. I feel like I don't see myself worth like doing anything. So depending on the groups, that we belong to, that actually has a direct consequence on who we become in the process. And what happens is that when individuals evaluate their own group and themselves in relations to other group, as you said, like this comparison can influence self-esteem and may reinforce group favoritism or out group derogation. What happens is that social comparison can lead to individuals and groups feeling either superior, or I belong to that group, that group has all the access to networking opportunities, that group has all the access to funding, to wealth, to business opportunities, whereas like, look at that other group, they are inferior because they never get access to finance, they never get access to this, they are like always like secluded, they can never make things happen. And so that can lead to a lot of different things that happen. And if we go like throughout like social identity, we will see that there are so many things to be covered, and it's a huge topic. Today, what we're doing, we are just exploring like
Right.
little parts of it, but at least to give like a strategic insight how much our in groups and our out groups actually impact us so much, depending on which group is being considered at the time and at the stage of our lives.
Yeah, and as you said, Selena, today we are just, like we often say, we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and that's often what we see in the society. But we are going to go a little bit underneath the water, but we won't go deep into the water. But just having those key terms, for example, maybe I'm pretty sure because when we were preparing this discussion, I was asking some questions and I thought it was maybe important for the audience as well to know maybe we are talking about in groups and out groups and we are talking about so many key terms and I think it's very important for the audience and for everyone listening to us to understand what those key terms, for example the in groups and out groups, actually mean. So I think, Selena, if you could maybe enlighten us and help us understand, and let's go forward with this discussion.
Okay, so uh, an in-group is usually like it's a group to which, for example, you belong, a person belongs or identifies with. For example, I belong to the AfriTech Fellowship. So like the members of an in-group would often share a sense of loyalty, common identity, solidarity. I belong, for example, to the Women in Tech group.
Hmm.
So which means that this is a group that once you're part of that group, you identify with it. Or I belong to the red. I like, for example, XYZ football team.
Hmm.
So I belong to that team. I love, watching all the things about that group. I have a sense of loyalty to that team. I have a common identity. I love when that team wins. I really feel like I have a huge sense of belonging to that group. So this is like an in-group. And in our lives, actually, every human being belongs to several in-groups. Whether from the day we're born, like whether we go to school, whether we attend university, whether we belong to a company, whether we are like we work like with a group of we belong to a networking group, or we belong to a fellowship group, or a fitness group. Everyone forms part of an in-group. And when it comes to out-groups, an out-group is like a group to which a person does not belong to, but you may feel the competition or the opposition towards. So let's say, for example, I love, I'm just taking an example here, okay, to all the football lovers. I'm not like a fan of XYZ, but let's say, for example, I say I love Manchester. So my in-group is Manchester United, for example. So the out-group would be Liverpool. It's still a football group, but I see that group as a competition. Though it's still a group, but I don't feel any sense of belonging because it's like the opposition to me, and I may develop like a kind of prejudice. All right. So just to clarify, any guys who thinks like I belong to this or that football group, I just took it as an example. And what happens is that it happens as the same, for women groups as well. We can be part of a woman in group. So we belong to this association, we belong to this regroupment, we belong to this platform. But at the same time, there is another platform of women who we do not belong to. So it is for us an out group because we may even feel we feel that, oh my God, it's competition, or we may even feel like some opposition towards. And what happens is that a lot of times when we start to compare, this is where like we can actually create like some different prejudices. That is why like we always say like it's always good for people to go and experience, to have their own experiences with different groups so that they can have like their own part of story for themselves
Hmm.
to understand more about it. But it's important also to understand that there's a difference, the difference between the in groups and the out groups is rooted in the social identity that has different aspects. So it's not just based on one thing, and it's a group dynamic as well. It's not a stagnant thing because we may form part of certain in groups at the beginning, for example, of our career, and then at reaching the mid-level of our career, we join other in groups. And it may happen that we were part of an in-group that in the future, because we joined other in-groups, that other in-group that we form part of becomes an out-group as well. So it all depends at which stage we are. But what happens is that there are so many aspects also that denote social identity, and we can look at that afterwards as well, Anne-Gaëlle. I don't know what you think.
I actually am again mind blown about how deep this whole conversation is because in a way, when you think about it, that means that every in group is kind of an out group as well. And this is very interesting because when we are in a group, like you said, we only identify as like our group, like what it is, but we do not think that our belonging within this group is actually affecting another group who is an in-group to itself, but is an out-group to us. And this is, like so cryptic, but at the same time, it makes so much sense. And yeah, you actually broke my heart because I'm a Liverpool fan, but that's okay. I won't be,
Oh no,
I
I
won't.
didn't. I didn't specify what I'm a Liverpool or Manchester fan. I just
So, but it's very interesting, and I like the fact that you actually took the football team as an example because I think it's something that everybody can understand, and mainly here in Mauritius, how this word like between Manchester and Liverpool is so it's tangible like most of the time, and I think it's very easy to actually understand this. And I like how you talk about the difference between those two and how within a lifetime, within our career journey, or even our personal journey, we go through those phases in group, out group, or both at the same time. And it's dynamic. Like you say, it's constantly evolving. And it actually reminded me of a quote that came across this week that actually said, the only constant is in life is change. And that's so true. Again, it's something that you realize once you read it. That, I mean, before seeing this quote, maybe I knew it, but I didn't realize it. And when I read this quote, I was actually shocked how much this was true because everything is constantly changing, but we do not necessarily feel it or think about it. Just like the picture is showing moon, the moon is constantly changing and coming back to what it was like and becoming a full moon again, a crescent moon. And our life is the same. It's dynamic and it's showcasing how everything that we are doing today might not be the same tomorrow. Maybe it might be worse. Maybe it might be better. But it shows also that if today is looking bad, it doesn't mean that your whole life will be bad and that it's constantly evolving and changing. And I think, like you said, you were talking about the different maybe aspects of social identities. And maybe that's one thing that we could discuss now. And what were like the aspects that maybe we should remember and think about when we are talking about social identity?
Definitely. And as you shared, like, for example, that changes is constant. That's the same thing for social identities. But it's important also to understand there are certain things that remain static, like
Mhm.
your personal identity. For example, when you are born, let's say in Mauritius, so you get a birth certificate. That one remains static. So you can't go to, for example, to the government one day and say, hey, if I'm born in the 1980s or 1990s, now I want to be labeled as born in 2020, for example. That is not possible. That is not possible. So
Unfortunately.
yes, so those ones are quite static. And for example, the ones that we are born into, like the nationality as well, it's part of our personal identity, but the nationality as to which group of country we belong is a social identity. So, for example, if your birth certificate says you were born in Mauritius, you can't go, for example, to the United States and say, no, I was born in the United States just because I decided I was. So that one cannot change. So that's why it's important to understand the slight difference of what is static, but social identities are usually dynamic. So there's no one specific way to actually how would I say to acquire that. So which means that sometimes we can be born into a social identity group. For
Mhm.
example, we are born into a given generation, for example, and you would see a lot of lawyers also come from families who have been practicing law
Mhm.
in the past. So that is an example of someone who is born, for example, into a social identity group and who forms part, for example, of a community and who decides as a result of that social identity to make the specific choice of becoming a lawyer.
Okay.
You can see that also for those, for example, a lot of people who decide to become a doctor, for example. Many
Mhm.
times it's sometimes it's not just by because they love a subject, but sometimes it's because someone in their family, it could be also like a doctor or their parents or an auntie. And we see that that is a trend and how much like social identity can affect people and how much it can affect people also like in poverty cycles at the same time. You know,
Mhm.
if you belong, for example, to if some people stay, for example, in vulnerable areas, whenever like they need to go and find and look for a job, many times, especially in the past, we had like a lot of prejudice that was like thrown on people who would be living from, in a specific area of a country or in a specific district, like they will be labeled. And that would
Mhm.
give them like an assigned social identity just because of a location that they are. And that's quite interesting. So there are some of the social identities that we are kind of born into or that we choose to remain in depending on our surroundings, but still over times, a lived experience may create a new social identity. For example, an accident, an illness
Mhm.
can change our ability status. An illness can also change, our path of career. A life-changing event, can change our social identity as well. Some social identities are visible, and while others are invisible. And some social identities we may hold our whole life, while others may shift throughout our lives. So, for
Mhm.
example, let's say if we used to belong to a singles group, like once like people get married, so they tend to want to favor like more couples group at times. This can happen
Mhm.
at the same time. So, which means that social identities are dynamic. In that sense, it is dynamic. So, in that sense, it is not static. So, it can change over time. And
Mhm.
according to CCL, it was like the Creative Center for Leadership. I remember it also said that everyone has multiple social identities and combinations matter. So although like a social identity is often talked about in terms of a single category, for example, in the United States, someone can say, "Hey, I belong to the Republican group." The other white will say, "I belong to the Democrat group." In South Africa, some say, "Hey, I'm black." Some say, "Hey, no, I belong to the white community." So everyone actually has multiple social identities that
Mhm.
combine together in unique ways that influence our lived experience and interaction. So what happened is that it's important to understand we were mentioning earlier about social categorization that leads to social comparison. So for example, let's say the experience of a white person who is born into a wealthy family is going to be different from someone who is not born into a wealthy family.
Mhm.
But if that same person has different lived experience and interactions with a network of wealthy people, that person can also actually produce wealth. But
Hmm.
many times what we see, and for examples in the allocation of land as well, people have also um social identities that are linked to land. So, for example, if someone it belongs to a group but can never access a land, for example, or access to social housing, decent social housing, that also impacts sometimes on the education on the person, on the career pathways, and the access to opportunities as well. So it's important to understand that we have multiple social identities and also not judge people because let's say, for example, someone comes, I come and I say, hey, I do social work. That is one. I belong to a group of that does social
Hmm.
work. That is one of my social identity among so many multiple others. And it's very important for us as women to understand that different women in our leadership, we have different hats. We wear different hats. So we belong to multiple social identities and we cannot just judge someone based on just one identity. So
Hmm.
that's quite interesting. And the other aspect is that it's sociological. So what speaks about sociological speaks about society. So, society and culture determines when and how differences between people become social identities. For example, eye color is not considered a social identity. Eye color is considered a personal identity.
Hmm.
But skin color is considered a social identity. Why? Because it's the society that assigned, hey, skin color, black, brown, yellow, white, or things like that. That's
Hmm.
quite interesting.
Yeah.
So it forms it was actually created in a mental process. So
Hmm.
and this is where it's an interesting, if we have to go further, today we're not covering everything, but if we have to go further, and we can understand, wow, that the personal identity complements the social identity, but it's not the same thing. My
Hmm.
eye color forms part of my personal identity, but my skin color forms part of my social identity. So,
Yeah.
and that is happens because social identities are norm dependent.
Hmm.
So if the country says, this is a social, like this is a social cultural group leading, or in this country, we are going to favor this approach, so our social identity is based on the country that we are born into. And according to the laws, we are dependent on that norm. And that also shapes, the way we actually belong to the groups.
Hmm.
Um, and that can change, and later on perhaps we can explore a bit more about culture. And the fourth point according to CCL was that social identities can be it can be more or less salient depending on the context. For example, certain social identities, they may feel more prominent in certain situation and context. For example, if you're a white American, from what I take an example from what CCL took, if you're a white American living in North America, you might not often think about your national identity. However, if you're an expat living in China, this might suddenly feel a huge part of your identity. So, for example, for us in Mauritius, we are Mauritians, so we live on an island in the Indian Ocean. So we don't think much about a lot about our national identity. But once we travel to Europe, this is where, we suddenly take conscious of, oh my God, I'm either an immigrant there or I'm either an expat or, we are
Hmm.
labeled because that's the reality. So it will likely impact how others see us and how we interpret our experiences from this. So if I can sum up this part of understanding, the different aspects that we have as part of social identity.
That's interesting because I think one aspect that it makes me think about, there's the saying that says, while life is happening to us, we are also happening to life. And there's a lot of things that are happening around us. We do not necessarily realize that it is shaping who we will become or who we will change and become for this reason. And I like how you talked about the way we are brought up. Yes, this is something like society and the way we are brought up, or something that we usually think about when we think about our identities because of this, our identities because of our post traumas, etc., etc. But is one of the interesting things that you brought up was how our society itself, like the leading parties or the people at the head of our countries or people at the head of democracy are actually also impacting our social identities. And this is something that we do not necessarily realize, and how multidimensional we also are. Um, I like also the fact that you covered how my eyes is a personal identity trait, but my skin color is social. How, like for me, this does not make sense because it's supposed to be the same thing. But again, it's showing us how society and how people that led at some point within a country decided that this was something that, as we said at the beginning, put us into a box, and we are able to like divide and conquer. And that's actually crazy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's so many things to even like to share on the topic. But if we go to a small like case study of according to Howarth, who in 2002, who developed also more things on social identity, he said that social identity can be negatively affected by the prejudicial attitudes. And this shows that there are so many prejudicial attitudes, and these sometimes are actually located into the minds of people who may be leading us as well.
Mm-mm,
So if it's, I just take, for example, in the past in UAE, women were not allowed to drive a car.
mhm,
Women were simply not allowed to drive a car because it was against the law. So
mhm,
it was given by those who were actually leading the country. So the
mhm,
social identity of women, like going to kind of like buy a car, was not allowed, you know. And nowadays now women, for example, in Dubai are allowed to drive,
mhm,
which makes a difference. So perhaps it's important to understand that the way people lead us and the way we women leaders, we lead our groups,
mhm.
will impact on whether like we're building self-esteem, whether we're creating opportunities for other women, or whether we are consciously or unconsciously like creating prejudicial attitudes. Sometimes, again, it can be conscious, sometimes it's unconscious as well.
Wow. Yeah, I think these negative, like these prejudices are present all around us, and we sometimes are, like you say, we are aware of it. Sometimes we are not necessarily aware of it. We are just playing within the game they've set for us to play. And I think this kind of bring us within this discussion section where we want to know maybe what are some examples of prejudicial attitudes that we see towards women, maybe.
That's interesting. Uh, well, there are so many actually because uh, prejudicial attitudes towards women, they can be stereotypes, they can be discriminatory beliefs that contribute to gender equality. Why I mentioned that? Because since the theme of International Women's Day is about gender equality, about accelerating actions,
Mhm,
and so there can be a lot of bias, for example, in the past, I take from like 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have a lot of women CEOs because we had that gender stereotype in the past, and it's still present till now, that said, women are too emotional to be leaders.
mhm.
Which assume that like, hey, women are going to lack rationality in decision making because women are meant, just like to be emotional with raising the kids, taking care of the man, taking care of the family, or women, I remember like when I
Being
was
the
born, there
caretaker.
was still this stereotype.
Hmm.
Women belong in the home, not the workplace. People used to say, but men are naturally better at mathematics, at science than women. So they were undermining women's abilities in STEM fields.
Yeah.
And and these are still present to a certain degree, lesser than I would say than 40 years ago. But these are like some examples. And even like workplace discrimination. In the past, there was a huge pay gap, assuming that
Hmm.
women, earn less than men for the same job. It's only like something like for the last 10 years that there have been like some lobbying to adjust the pay rate that women earn like the same for the same level of responsibility as the
Hmm.
over gender. And then there was also like the glass ceiling, as I was mentioning earlier, believing that women are less capable of holding higher level executive positions. And we had also that penalty on motherhood, where like some of the leaders assume that women with children are less committed to their jobs. It's
Hmm.
only over the last 10 years, the last 8 years, 5 years, that there has been like things like uh, leaves, parental leaves, motherhood leaves, and things like that. But before that, I remember like when I started my very first time I started working, that did not really exist, And people were saying like, oh my God, this woman is going to get pregnant, so she's not going to be committed to her job or blah, blah, blah. So there were always
Hmm.
like reasons like to make sure that she doesn't like the job and that she leaves. So there are a lot of these prejudices, and it can be also social and cultural as well.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
say a woman's worth is based on her appearance. The woman, is too weak for certain jobs, and then prejudice also. There's also, unfortunately, the sexual objectification,
Yeah.
where they say, hey, a woman should dress only a certain way to be respected. So
Yeah.
they decide, like some people decide in their mental process to give a
Yeah.
policy to women's clothing choices. So
I
these
know.
are,
And it's like when you were talking about the the prejudicial attitudes that exist towards women. And when you were talking about Howard's case study, you did mention as well how it also impacts our way of consuming. And I like the way that you talked about the way people identify women and the way we are supposed to dress, the way we're supposed to look like, the way we are supposed to be present within a society that, in a way, or like obviously also belong to us, but we do not necessarily have a voice or have a say within those things. And I think, yes, it's different nowadays, in some spaces, but it's going to, I think it still need to progress. And it actually brings me to the next slide, which is a quote that was very important for me to share with you guys today, because when I saw this quote, and I'm sure it's like one of those things that once you see, you can't unsee it. And I saw this quote and I was mind blown. I was so deeply shocked that it meant so much. So it was a quote from one of my favorite author called Sonia Renee Taylor, which said, "Living in a society structured to profit from our self-hate creates a dynamic in which we are so terrified of being ourselves that we adopt terror-based ways of being in our bodies. All this is fueled by a system that makes large quantities of money off our shame and bias. These experiences are not divergent, but complementary. Just like we were talking at the beginning, how all of those social identities, social comparison, categorization are pieces of dominoes is the same thing. It's not divergent. It's actually complementary. When this thing happened, this other thing will happen at some point. And for me, this sentence, the very first sentence saying that living in a society structured to profit from our sales hate, this only this part for me is telling me how we've evolved within a society that actually benefits from it. And we are actually still giving them money, still actually letting them set the tone for our consumption. And this is crazy to me. I don't know if you want to bounce back on this quote, Selena.
Definitely, I must say, fortunately and unfortunately as well. Unfortunately, the image of women leadership, the image of women, um, is influenced a lot. Our social identity is influenced a lot towards the different groups that we belong, but also like towards what is advertised by
Hmm.
society. So and what happens is that, let me take for an example, uh, 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, it was like trendy for women to be slim.
Hmm.
Like a woman, the models would be advertised, they would be slim, So what was sold most was like, the image of a successful woman should be, very slim.
Hmm.
Then afterwards, like just a couple years ago, I know, like 2 decades before. Then there was a new trend, So like this image of a successful woman was one, who would have, for example, big boobs,
Hmm.
silicone implants. So that was, what that was advertised, and obviously like it was generating a lot of money in the industry as well. And then
Hmm.
afterwards, like over the last few years, a new image of women like came forth. So it's
Hmm.
sprouted as like, the image of a successful woman is the one, who has a nice, shapely posterior, who does a BBL.
Yeah.
And that like fueled, again, like the industry because it brings money. So it's quite interesting, like the definition of what the society labeled as, a woman having a slim body, and now a woman who should have like this shape or that shape.
Hmm.
It can be like highly contradictory. And this is why like it's important to understand, the groups that we belong to, can simply it influences, and whether we want it or not, we all belong to those groups. If we're in a group, that where people, for example, where women love to wear makeup, even if we don't like to wear makeup, at the end of the day, we will start loving to wear makeup, and it's
Hmm.
totally natural.
Yeah.
There's nothing against that. So the group that we belong to, after 1.5 to 2 years, starts to impact our decision making process. And
Okay.
it's and this is why like in women, in women leadership, like we need to understand, like to assess our different social identities, the different in groups and our groups in our surroundings, and also like how much are we like buying into culture and the advertising of what is labeled. And sometimes, they would label like, a successful women should always be wearing, a woman's suit or high heels or things like that. That was the image also that was being given, in the past. So if you have a career, you are seated, in an office, white collar job. So that means you're a successful woman,
Hmm.
because it was a selling picture, or you have that, you have to do that degree to become like a successful woman so that women look at you, in a more positive thing. So because at the behind this, there's a commercial aspect,
Yeah.
advertising sells. And I think like again, like there's so much to say. There's actually so much to say on this, Angel, and the code that you shared actually makes a lot of sense towards this
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think you kind of touched on that question when you were talking right now about how does it affect women leadership downwardly and upwardly? Because I think one thing that comes to mind right now is also how sometimes because of the society's ruling, I would say, they would they would tend to tell women, for example, that are too emotional, like you said earlier, and then women will tend to hide their emotions. They will tend to not show those emotions because they want to appear in a way more manly. And then they showcase this aspect of as part of their identity when it is actually not really. to begin with. So I guess it's kind of dynamic as well how it evolves. But I think it's kind of how this actually affect the leadership of a women downwardly or upwardly, because even women that are in high positions sometimes, if they had to give up part of their identity to become who they are, sometimes if they see another woman succeeding and being fully themselves, they feel threatened. They feel threatened and they don't know how to react to this, because for them, it's not normal to arrive at this point and still be yourself, because they had to change. They had to go through that process of change, you know?
Definitely. Definitely. That's true. And that process is it's a long process. And
Hmm.
at the end of the day, it's also important to understand that all human beings, whether all genders, whether we are men or at the workplace or in our daily lives, whether women or men, whatever gender is, like we all have emotional attachments to
Hmm.
our in groups. We all have emotional attachments. That's like very subtle sometimes. Sometimes it's more profound, but we all have emotional attachments. And sometimes these emotional attachments can also become like make us like become blind because we say, no, I belong to that group, even if it's a group that's causing like prejudice to other people, because I belong to that group, because of my emotional attachment, I will still think positively of that group, even if it's causing injustice or whatsoever. And it's actually it's part of human behavior
Hmm.
until and unless that person uh, is like brought into other situations where that person can explore a different way of seeing things.
Thank you so much, Selena. And I think this brings us to the last question for the conversation section, which is maybe what are the tips and how can women maybe improve their social identity? Maybe it's a big word to say, how can we improve our social identity in the long run? But maybe make us feel more like ourselves, I would say, and be okay with that.
Yes, yeah, I support that as well. Just to add a thing on what previously, one of the things that some studies say that that women, just coming back to the a downward impact, first
Hmm.
of all, is that sometimes women at leadership level tend to get less sponsorship
Yeah.
and support for finance, for projects and things like that. So a way, for example, to navigate this is sometimes they actually say is to talk more about it and
Hmm.
label it as it is, or actually create like a group of network of women, who can like together mobilize resources that could create greater weight since we're speaking also about women leadership. And even though women leadership has progressed a lot, we know that women are sometimes still excluded from key decisions making in some
Hmm.
sectors. And a way, that there's that thing that says, if you're excluded, from the table, you're not given a seat, bring your own chair.
Yeah.
Or create your own table, create your own door, create your own program
Yeah.
and go learn. Don't stop learning, and the interesting thing also is don't be afraid to join other groups, even if it's for a short time, or don't be afraid to join other groups because there's always something, at least something positive that will come out of an in-group.
Hmm.
There's some in-groups that are highly positive, some others less, but there's always a key lesson to learn. Don't be afraid like to fail forward.
Hmm.
For women, it's important to understand that failing forward is part of being, into groups. It's part of forming part of memberships in society. Not everything is going always to go very right. As I say, sometimes women are still in certain settings, from in certain in groups, they are still like devalued in terms of their
Mm-hmm.
contributions, in terms of access to opportunities, to finance, to funding, but compared to men. But still, women have been shown to be more committed. Women groups have been shown to be way more committed into making things happen. So don't be afraid, like, to join women groups. Don't be afraid, like, to go volunteer with some groups. Don't be afraid, like, to even learn a new skill, a new activity, like something that at least keeps us moving in a way. Even if, like, someone is differently able, there are now so many online learning courses, there are so many podcasts, there's so many, like, information. Access to information is now wider.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, like, it's important for us as women to never stop learning and never stop trying and never stop being afraid of like never be afraid of failing forward, because failing forward is actually healthy. This is
Mm-hmm.
what sets the stone to actually shape our character and help us improve our leadership role. We become better women leaders the
Mm-hmm.
more we fail forward. And the more we keep listening, to what's happening in our in groups, the more, like, we understand that we are allowed to give more opportunities to others. We're allowed to trust others more, even if, they may not, like, always be up to the expectations that we have, but at least we are trying. And then,
Mm-hmm.
like, as women leaders, it's important also to know, like, to assess our emotional attachments and to understand when to leave an in group, for example, that as well.
Yeah.
If we see, like, we're at a stage, a season in our life where we need to leave an in group and join another one, don't be afraid to do that as
Mm-hmm.
well. Because we're meant, again, like, social identities are like very dynamic, you know, and since we're speaking about celebrating women, accelerating actions is a huge part of, like, being part of in groups as well. So that would be like a tip that I would
Thank you.
share.
Thank you, Selena. And I like that specific point that you said, call it what it is. I hate it when people around us pretend that it does not exist just so that they do not need to face it. There's different social identities that exist. For instance, a lot of people, there's this, I'm sure all of you at some point you've heard something like, I don't see colors, we are all the same. But actually saying that, you are denying me part of my identity because you are saying that I do not exist and that we are all the same. But for me, it's calling it what it is and actually saying that, yes, we are different, but we also all have our place in this society and not being colorblind at the end of the day. Because I'm sorry, if you are saying that you don't see colors, I'm sorry, my friend, you are colorblind. And I think with that, I will open the floor to maybe questions from the audience. Um, who might have more questions. I do see a question from Geshna in the chat. So I will maybe take that question first. And if any of you have more questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and let us know if you want to just speak and unmute yourself. So, Selena, I think that's a question for you. Because I'm actually wondering as well. Geshna said, "Hello, ladies. One question: can social identity be linked to imposter syndrome? What would you say to that?"
Definitely. Definitely. Because it's important to understand, like, first of all, I think I mentioned there's also a key difference. Like, uh, personal identity emphasizes, like, individuality.
Hmm.
Okay. But social identity highlights belonging to a group. So what happens is that so social identity in regards to a group, if in your group, for example, you have people that tend to be feel more superior, you can
Hmm.
actually, like, if you're giving the opportunity, you can feel like, oh my, I have an imposter syndrome based on other people. But then at the same time as well, it's important to understand that sometimes the imposter syndrome can also be related to trauma from our personal identity that
Mm-hmm.
we are also projecting on the group.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where, like, in some instances, yes, social, because we have different social identities. If we are part of a group that does not have a safe space, that is not welcoming, that is not encouraging, that does not give you opportunity to push forward, that does not give you opportunity, to even challenge decisions,
Mm-hmm.
that can lead to a lot of prejudice, that can lead to a lot of fear, that can lead to imposter syndrome as well. But
Mm-hmm.
imposter syndrome is based on so many other criteria. But yes, if we belong to a group where like that in-group actually has so much impact on our mental process, it will definitely create any form of influence, whether a positive one or a downward one.
Okay, thank you, Selena. And actually, I have a follow-up question based on that. I think um I think I kind of have the answer, but I'm trying to maybe put it out there. Is would you say that a an in-group will have more impact on the imposter syndrome arising within an individual or an out-group? Because I mean, like, I know within an in-group, we are part of it, and the out-group is mostly like external pressure. But would you say that an in-group has more power on an individual to feel imposter syndrome or an out-group?
I would say, first of all, because we all belong to in-groups. So
Mm-hmm.
in-groups have a significant impact, especially in
Okay.
leadership and workplace dynamics. So if we are part, for example, of a company, uh, we are part of a department, that is an in-group, for example. And,
Mm-hmm.
you can have in-group favoritism where, people prefer and support members of their own group. And that affects both, who gets the leadership roles and how leaders are perceived, how tasks, are assigned. And that definitely impacts leadership. That definitely creates, that can create, in-group bias as well. So
Mm-hmm.
what happens, sometimes there can be exclusion of out-group members, which means that others may struggle to break into leadership networks. Or, for example, in a company, one department can actually be create exclusion towards another department because perhaps one head of department does not like people from another department. So when the other people from the department may try, uh, to add value to a project, they
Mm-hmm.
are met with an indistinct form of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's preference for similarity. Sometimes people in power as well, they promote those who resemble them. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever you are in group, you try, for example, you support that, but then someone in an out group who is also in a similar group than you sees that you're promoting that similarity, like to just, support only one type of leadership. What happens is that that other person in that out group can feel like imposter syndrome as well. But it's important to understand we all have in groups and out groups. So whether you are in an in group, what you're supporting in an out group, you could actually be rejecting in an out group, and what you might be seeing as opposition in an out group might also like become like a similarity in your in group. So
Mm-hmm.
it all depends on various in groups circumstances, but we all form part of in groups. We all have out groups. It applies to every single human being on earth.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously there are bias with the way, with our emotional attachments, with the way, we perceive things in our in groups, and the way, we perceive things, towards out groups.
Thank you so much, Selena. I don't know if we have more questions or if
I
anyone
don't know
wants
if
to
I
unmute
answered the question
themselves.
or you want you
No,
want me to
yes.
develop further?
No, I think it makes sense because as I said before, when I was asking the question, for me, I thought that it would be mostly the in-group because the in-group has more impact, like you said, on us because they're closer to us compared to the out-group. But I think in a way, both of them has an impact on us, whether we
Yeah,
want
both.
it or not. And it all depends on how much of an impact and how much of contact it actually gets to us. And that's when maybe the imposter syndrome can arise. So that's
Yeah.
very interesting. Thank you for answering that question.
And
I don't
and
know
if I
if,
sorry, if I can
yeah,
add
go
a little
ahead.
part of it. Also, sometimes there is like resistance from the existing in group. For example, let's say a woman enters a male-dominated leadership in group. She may feel exclusion or skepticism in the
Hmm.
beginning, or sometimes you can be in an in group and there are double standards as well. So what happens
Yeah,
is like if you as part of that in group you don't conform to the dominant in group straight leader, sometimes you may be seen as weak, you may be seen as too soft, you may be seen as, if you want to be assertive, sometimes you may be seen as too aggressive. So there are
yeah,
actually, and this is something that is really embedded in the local in the local structure, there are a lot of double standards, and that
yeah.
happens because uh, uh, actually we must understand that the more we educate ourselves,
Hmm.
the more we learn, the more we understand the different leadership styles, the different social identities, the more we understand ourselves, the more we understand our assignment and attachment to in groups, and all in groups have actually the positive and less positive influences on us. So we all have like a certain form of bias towards certain out groups, but at the end of the day, sometimes it's always important like to also listen to others, but sometimes it's also important to go and make like our own decision. But so it like I know like another question that may come out of it is then like, but what about if I heard something wrong about an out group? Well, if it's
Yeah.
justified, if there are proofs and things like that, that could be like a stepping stone to make a decision already.
Hmm.
But if not, then like one may want to perhaps join an out group that becomes an in group, but then it doesn't mean, that it would be always welcomed. As I'm saying, like there can be a lot of resistance. And
Yeah.
sometimes it happens a lot, in women leadership. It happens a lot in women leadership because there's a lack at national level, in corporate entities, in associations, the social world, in a lot of different sectors, because there's a lack of mentorship, there's a lack of ongoing learning, there's a lack, for example, addressing topics like we are addressing, like, and understanding that, we don't just have one identity. Our personal identity is like a fixed one, but,
Hmm.
and it evolves sometimes also depending on our attributes and characters, but we have different social identities. And once a woman understands that, then she starts seeing another woman with a different lens.
Hmm.
But if another
Yeah.
woman would not understand that, so we have a fixed mindset, and then like, it creates a lot of opposition. There's a lot of
Hmm.
competition, and it happens at all in all cases.
Yeah, I agree with you with all what you're saying. And like we were discussing, I think it's multidimensional and intersectional when we talk about someone's identity. And often, more often than not, we tend to only see the tip of the iceberg, so only the things that are visible, but there's so many aspects of a social identity which is just invisible to the eye and invisible to people who don't know you. And I like that you said that once we do see that, we see the world and we see others through a different lens. And thank you for this, Selena, and thank you for this amazing session and discussion. I don't know if we have 5 more minutes. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything. I do see a comment from Geishna in the chat. Thank you so much, Geishna, who said, "Thank you so much, ladies. Really insightful session. The AfriTech Connect sessions are only getting better and better. Totally love them. Thank you for your support, Geshna, and for being here with us. And thank you for all of you who are listening as well. I don't know if you have any comments or anything you would like to share before we close this discussion. Or maybe you, Selena, if you have any last words before we close it.
My last word is don't be afraid to explore, you know,
Okay.
our
Yeah.
different social identities. And it's also healthy for women to join in groups where there are men as well. And it's very
Hmm.
healthy for men to join in groups of women. It's very
Okay.
healthy, actually. And it's important in the decision process making of women leadership to be creating also a safe space for women, but also to create a safe space for men also like to help in that leadership process. So we should be open for both genders to help in
Yeah.
that in that process, in that journey of leadership towards women, as again, like the theme is accelerating action. And we can only accelerating action, by being welcoming to the contribution of men and women at the same time.
Thank you, Selena. And
That's
I
my
think,
last word.
thank you for your last word. And I think we should not forget to celebrate women in the exploration of more positive social identities. Like you said, keep exploring and just be yourself. And if the yourself that you are today is something that you want to change tomorrow, keep exploring because, like Selena said, keep learning and failing forward. And with that, I think I will say that this is the end of our discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on this episode of the AfriTech Connect. And we really hope that today's discussion helped you or was interesting to you all. And if you missed any of the last episode of the AfriTech Connect, please feel free to see it, to go review them on our YouTube channel. Or if you want to be in the loop on any of episode that might happen in the future. Please follow us on our social media and also for the month of March, just like this one was the launch of the special edition, the special series for Women History Month. We also have 4 more sessions coming up in March where with amazing panel discussion and speakers from around the world, not just Mauritius. And I'm very excited to have all those discussions with those people. And I would like to say a big thank you to my co-host tonight, Selena, who brought to us not only her knowledge, but also her bubbly personality and all of her social identities to share with us. And thank you to each one of you who attended this session or who will be rewatching this video on YouTube. And until next time, like Selena say, keep exploring and embracing that spirit of exploration, but also keep innovating. Thank you so much. Bye bye.